All right, we're back with a new episode. This one's going to be about why we don't see twin turbochargers on turbo diesels. Does it happen? Yeah, but in very rare circumstances. It's not a very popular choice. We're going to kind of go over why it's not a popular choice using some maps and whiteboards and what they're all about. So the big thing with twin turbos, and when we're talking about twin turbos, we're talking about real twin turbos, not compounds. So not just two turbos in an engine bay, we're talking about two turbos that are being driven by one half of the number of cylinders each. So if it was a 6-cylinder engine, one turbocharger is getting 3 cylinders, the other turbocharger is getting 3 cylinders. On a V8, one turbocharger is getting 4 cylinders, the other turbocharger is getting the other bank of 4 cylinders. One of the reasons that you see twins a lot is packaging. A lot of times it's easier to package twin turbos into a setup because they can be mounted up close to the block on V8 applications, or they can remote mount them up forward, and you can use two smaller turbochargers with a combined flow capacity that'll support the amount of air you need to make the horsepower you want on the spark ignition engines, versus trying to package a big single turbocharger. Usually you see big singles on more like pro mod or chassis cars where the engine's typically moved back, or there's nothing in the bumper, there's no AC condenser, there's no transmission coolers up in the nose is a lot more open, so packaging a big single up front is a lot easier. Whereas vehicles that do have AC or those other things like that, where you're better off, there's just no room to put the turbos up front. A lot of times you'll see them get tucked down next to the frame rails as twins. Heat reasons, twin turbos on gas engines work really good to minimize the amount of hot piping, because you have 2 headers that go to 2 turbochargers, and then you have your exhaust. Whereas with a big single, you have a white pipe going around somewhere that can have to get lengthened, or just not possible to get the fit over there. Sometimes you see big singles versus twins as well. We're just going to flip this the other way, where there's nowhere to put the twin of the other turbocharger. So on a V8 where you got 2 banks, the only space to put a turbocharger might be on one side or the other. So typically you're not going to put 2 on the same side unless they're an inline 6 engine like the Supras and just say the RX. I think some of the RX-7s came with the sequential, which is a whole other topic because it's 2 twins. So in those cases, a lot of times it's just packaging reasons. When we get into like horsepower capacities, when you start getting into really big horsepower numbers, the turbos start to get really big. So up to like 1,000 horsepower, the turbos don't get too crazy big. They're usually fittable in a lot of places, but you start getting into the 1,500 horsepower range, a single turbo that flows 150 pounds a minute, they definitely exist. The problem is fitting them in your engine bay if you have things that you like your AC and other things, might not be feasible, where running 2 turbos that flow a combined flow rate of 150 are a lot easier to package. On turbo diesels, the old stuff, plenty of room, new stuff, not a lot of room. The reason, so if you watched our other videos, we showed you how to use the compressor map and how to calculate what's going on using the boost pressure, the intercoolant, all that stuff. And we're going to use tools from those videos in here to show why I don't see twins on turbo diesels. As you might notice, we have an RPM where we have, we'll go over what these are for, but essentially these are RPMs. And if your diesel's at 9,000 RPMs, it's probably not in one piece. Some people have been kind of open about it or heard about it, but it looks like at least over at Power Driven Diesel, I think they recorded 8,060 or 8,080. I might be shortchanging them a little bit, but 8,080 RPMs before they literally just pulled the rod bolts apart. And those are big rod bolts, and they just yanked them in half for the size of that piston, changing direction like that. So for the most of us, we're actually going to operate 2,000 to 4,000. Some of us will be in the 5, and realistically, 6,000 RPM guys are only going to be your pro mod diesel stuff. So essentially, if we're going to try and make this class or education series on what most of us are going to be seeing, most of us are going to be between 2,000 and 4,000 RPMs. A few of us will be at 5. A lot of people can rev the 5, doesn't mean you're making power 5. That'll be another thing on turbo housings. So most of us will be between 2 and 4. and probably the mass majority of us will be between 2 and 3. I know I operate my daily driven turbo diesel between 2 and 3 when I drive work and when I drive home, because about once you get past this mark and you're heading up on this mark, you can get there pretty fast and it's a lot of fun. So next part, we'll explain what like twin turbos are and like the basis of what a twin turbo is. Two turbos that are the same size get fed two separate banks of cylinders, but they feed into a common plenum. What it means is that the compressor capacity of your turbocharger is doubled. So if we have
bring it closer if you want. That's good.
If we have this turbocharger here that flows 100 pounds a minute, if we ran it in twins with 2 of them on the engine and their compressor outlets both feeding into a common plenum, that means we can now pull 200 pounds a minute with this setup.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it sounds really good. The issue is that that's like the air. It's like an air filter, right? You always want to view the compressor or the compressor map. That's your like looking at how much your air filter flows. So if our compressor map flows 100 pounds a minute of air, our air filter, our compressor flows 800 pounds a minute. If we put 2 air filters on, 2 turbochargers on, that feed into a common plenum, just like if we ran a pipe that split out to 2 air filters, the air filters flow double. So instead of 100 pounds a minute, they now flow 200 pounds a minute. Doesn't mean that we get 200 pounds a minute, it just means that it can flow up to now 200 pounds a minute. The big thing you gotta do, and we will demonstrate it, why those videos that we did on how to calculate your compressor flow is important, because we're gonna show you why with a very limited RPM engine, twin turbos just don't work on turbo diesels. Now they work if you have a helper turbo, but we'll do that on another episode. So, what you essentially do if you were trying to plot a map for one of these, you would just double all these numbers. So, if you had 2 turbos on the system, your pressure ratio stays exactly the same. These flow numbers will get doubled. Because now, if say your system is flowing 60 pounds a minute, and you have 2 of these, and it's 60 pounds a minute at a 2.2 pressure ratio, then instead each turbocharger will be actually having 30 pounds a minute drawn through it at a 2.2 pressure ratio. So you actually end up over in this area on the turbocharger, whereas if it was a single, you would end up over in the 60 pound mark. So that's essentially what it is. You want to think of twin turbos like adding another air filter to the system. You have one engine pulling through 2 filters versus one engine pulling through 1 filter. So on things that rev really high, twin turbos work great. Again, it allows you a lot of mass flow without taking up necessarily a lot of space or costing a lot of money. That's the other thing with these really big turbochargers, 100+ millimeter units, they get really expensive. They'll be, I know turbos up where the 130 millimeter mark, they will be at or near $6,000 to $10,000 a piece, and they go up from there. So what we have here is a 359 cubic inch turbo diesel, inline 6, because so I'm used to doing all the math with. I have everything out. If you want to do it with a 6.6 Duramax or 6.0 Power Stroke, we all do the same thing. But we're using a 5.9 liter 359 cubic inch engine for this. So we're leaving the volumetric efficiency all the same. All these numbers are done with a 80% VE, just to make this easy. So 359 cubic inches, 80% VE. These are all the NA, normally aspirated CFM numbers. So 2,000 RPMs, 166.2 CFM is what the engine's asking for. And at 9,000 RPMs, if you were able to pull that one off, I want to know, 747.92 CFM. So now that you know how to calculate compressor max, because you watched my videos and you hit the like button and subscribe, we're going to work everything in reverse. So the big thing is to kind of figure out a horsepower number. So let's say we wanted What's a realistic number? We'll do this in reverse. We'll use 600 horsepower. We're going to say we want 600 horsepower. What we're going to do is we're going to calculate how much boost pressure we need at each RPM to reach 600 horsepower. So what we're going to do is we'll take 600, divide that by 8. That is 75 pounds a minute. So now the next thing we gotta do is figure out how much boost pressure for each one. So what I like to do is we just run everything in reverse. So we're gonna take 75 pounds a minute, we'll divide that. Instead of multiplying it by the air's weight, we'll divide it by the air's weight. So we're gonna take that number, divide by the air's weight. We're gonna use just 0.07 like we did last time. Comes out to 1,000. $1,071.42 CFM. So now to figure out how much boost pressure we need, all you do is you take this number and you divide it by the CFM of each one of those. That's going to tell you the density ratio targets you have to reach. Depending on the compressor efficiency, that can actually be really close to the pressure ratio that you have to run. So what we're going to do is, if we want 600 horsepower at 2,000 RPMs, we're going to take this number, divide by 1. This equals, if we want to make 600 horsepower, we're going to need a 6.44 density ratio. And now this is probably the best example of why, like, the twin turbo thing. So if we ran 2 turbochargers that had a mass flow of 80 pounds a minute, so we're looking at 2 turbos that are about 40 pounds a minute, so S200s are a good example. You're going to have, the S200s at 2,000 RPMs in twin configuration are going to have to, they're going to have to run probably right around 80 pounds of boost per one. It's going to be about 70 to 80 pounds of boost. Just because you're going to have to overshoot the boost number a little bit just because of how hot the air is going to be. And those turbos probably aren't going to survive very well. What we're going to find is that as the RPM keeps going up, the boost pressure target's going to go down. So we can jump to 4,000 RPM. So we can take 1,071.42 divide by, we're just dividing by 0.07. Or no, we already did that, sorry. Divide by our CFM, there we go. So divide by 332. So 600 at 4K. It's a 3.22 density ratio. So see that things start to get more realistic. The only thing is that you're weighting essentially until 4,000 RPMs at this number. If we took this number, if you want to figure out the boost pressure or approximately where we're going to be, like just take your density ratio, multiply it by 14.7 minus 14.7. We're going to do that real quick. So that's 32 pounds of boost. So you're trying to take a turbocharger that would say normally spool by 1600 RPMs to say 20 pounds of boost, hopefully. And if you feed it with 50% less exhaust, because you just split it up into twins, instead of spooling at 1600 RPMs, it's going to spool right about 3200 RPMs. Is probably basically that you're going to have two S200s that are going to spool up to 20 pounds at 3,000, which is that's going to suck. And then as soon as you hit 4,000, you're going to be out of flow of those two compressors. So it's a really short window. You're looking at these windows that are only 1,000 RPMs long, if not less, drivability versus a 2,000 RPM drivability when a properly sized single turbo is selected. Right, so some of you may be thinking that the S200 example doesn't seem that extreme. It probably isn't. The only issue is that you're basically limited to running about 40 pounds of boost max, and you're going to have substantially more lag with the dual S200s than you would with a properly sized turbo that flows the same amount as a single, just because our window is so small. So if we want to look at like a spark ignition engine, they'll spool at 3 and they'll run to say 6,000 or 7,000. We need to spool, usually for our street driven rigs, we need to be spooled by 2 and drive to about 33 to 4,000 RPMs. So you have a really short window, which means that we typically have to run a lot of boost pressure to get the density ratio we need to make the motor think it's ingesting what it needs to make. A lot of us don't want to wait till 4,000 RPMs to make 600 horsepower. That's when we can make the same 600 horsepower at 3 by just increasing the boost pressure. The thing is that the two twins, can they handle 60 pounds of boost reliably? With the smaller turbochargers, usually it's a no. The smaller turbo gets the less boost they like to make, like total as far as survivability goes. The parts just get really small and they start spinning really fast. But let's take this kind of to an extreme level. We're going to do, we'll do 1,500 horsepower. There's enough people kind of making 1,500 horsepower. This would be fun, and for some of us that maybe want to make 1,500 horsepower, I'd like to make 1,500 horsepower. That's a lot of money in fuel to make that happen, and probably some broken parts along the way. So we're going to take our 1,500 horsepower, divide that by 8. Looking at, we need 187.5 pounds per inch. On a turbo diesel.
It's more than you.
There's not very many single turbochargers available that will do this. So nice. Like twins work good. The thing is to get two twins that flow, that they're going to be pretty good sized twins. So say we ran twin, what's something that flows 90 pounds a minute, 95. Basically we need two turbos that flow 95 pounds a minute. Basically, if we ran twin S369s, we know a single S369 on a 359 cubic inch engine in T4 arrangement, basically we need the highest flowing options. So T4 arrangement, they come in about 2,200 RPMs for most people. So if we ran that as twins, the same S369, instead of coming in at 2,200, we can expect the thing to kind of start to get to about 10, 12 pounds of boost by 4,000 RPMs. 4,000 to 4,400 RPMs is where we should start to see about 10 to 12 pounds of boost with that setup. I know pretty repetitively, 2,200 RPMs is about that 12 pounds of boost mark where the trucks start to make power, and then they domino effect real quick. Where once you get enough boost pressure, and the engine size starts to double up on itself and then double up again and double up again, you just got to really get that first double up. So you need to get to that first 14 pounds of boost, and then once you hit that first 14 pounds, it's easy street all the way up to 55, 60 pounds. So if you put this in twin arrangement, 3 cylinders feeding one, 3 cylinders feeding another, or you have a V8, 4 cylinders feeding one, 4 cylinders feeding another, you can expect that turbocharger to not come on until about 4,000 to 4,200 RPMs. That is a long wait for most of us with that. Either, especially if you have an 1,800 stall converter, one, you'll never get up on top of the converter. If you have a 2,000 stall converter, you never be able to get on top of the converter. You would need to run, if this is a competition setup, you would be running about a 4,000 stall to 3,800 stall converter just to be able to get up on top of these on the line or at the tree, which is pretty crazy. You'd have a lot of heat that you'd be dealing with that size converter stalled that loosely. If we were to look at this from the spark ignition standpoint, a 359 cubic inch engine, if it spooled the turbos, these two bigger units, without anti-lag by 4,000 RPMs, they still have 4,000 to 7,000 to go. If we spooled these turbochargers by 4,000 RPMs, we have either 1,000 to 2,000 RPMs left to go. So not a whole lot of RPM left compared to our spark ignition cousins, which makes it not as feasibly as far as something we would want to do. We know those turbos can handle the high boost as far as running both of them at 60 pounds. So what we can do is we can say 60 pounds of boost at 5,000 RPMs. What's that good for? Or we can see, we just look at the density ratio, I guess, real quick. So we could just take our 187.5, divide that by 0.07. 2,678.5 CFM. So we'll just take this, divide it by our 415.51. Gives us a 6.44 density ratio. If you wanted to just quick that, is when you get up to these high numbers, you're going to have to be running more boost pressure than what this equation gives you, but this is like the absolute minimum should your intercooling be amazing. We just take that times 14.7 minus 14.7 means we will need both turbos to be making 80 psi. So if we had two S369s that had turbines that flowed adequately at 80 psi and a lot of intercooling from water or air to water intercoolers and such, we would be able to net the 185 pounds a minute mass flow. It's super unrealistic for the majority of us to use this setup because the majority of us only had enough fuel to drive this to 40 pounds of boost, and we only revved it to the same 5,000 RPMs. If we were to use what we're doing right now, just taking the density ratio and multiplying it to get the pressure ratio, if we were to only run the 40 pounds of boost, because that's all we had fuel for, even though the cool factor is there, 40 plus 14.7 divided by 14.7. If this is perfect world, if we had, say, at 40 psi, perfect world would say be a 3.7 to density ratio. That's going to equal out to, we're going to take that, multiply it by 415.51. Then we're going to take that and multiply that by 0.07. Is only 108.23 pounds a minute times 8, or 865.84 horsepower is what we'd expect to see on that. So with your twin turbos that flow 187.5 pounds a minute, if you cannot drive them efficiently to 80 psi and instead you needed 40 psi, because both turbos are at 40 psi, but the mass flow of each turbocharger is split in half. So the 40 psi, say you drove them to 40 psi, but you couldn't get any higher, you would net 108.23 pounds a minute, meaning each turbocharger is flowing 54.111113 pounds a minute. But the big thing is both turbos still have to hit this pressure mark. So if it's twins, both turbos still have to do 80 psi for the density ratio. Both turbos have to still do 40 psi for the density ratio. Just the mass flow rate is divided by 2 now. So instead of the mass flow is 108.23 divided by up between the two turbochargers, 54 pounds a minute. Same here. If you had the two S369s, this would be 93 pounds a minute per turbocharger. So the turbochargers would survive because they're not being, the mass flow isn't getting too crazy, but they might not survive because the load on them is extreme. Whereas at 40 psi, which might be more realistic, but still hard to get to, it's going to take a high RPM to get to, the density ratio doesn't double up like you get with compounds. With compounding, you get basically get to double up the density ratio again because you compress it once and compress it twice. Where here, we're just compressing it once, but we're drawing through 2. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, please let me know. So in conclusion, I probably still didn't go over the 65. That's all you would make. 108.23 times 8 is 165.8 horsepower at the tire. That is what we would expect to see if you ran 2 turbos that both combined flowed 187.5 pounds a minute, but you could only give them the 40 pounds of boost on the dyno. We would expect to only see 108.23 pounds a minute pulled through. That's what the math says. This is really not taking into account intercooling and everything else. It'd probably be lower than that. You would only make 165.8 horsepower at the tire on the turbo diesel. Where you could run compounds with 2 turbochargers, split it up 40-40, and it'd be a lot easier. You still have to run ginormous turbocharger in compounds you'd have to find one turbo that flows 187.5 pounds a minute, which we're talking GT55 area. So it's still big, but I bet you it would probably have better manners than running twin S369s, as well as you wouldn't have to rev to 5,000 RPMs probably, because you could just go up to 100 pounds of boost and then probably reduce it down to like 4,400. It's easier on all your parts. Well, maybe not, because it's going to make more torque when you do that. But you're making 1,500 horsepower. We're doing all right. So in conclusion, why we don't really see real twin turbos on turbo diesels is because it's hard to get twin turbos to run the pressure ratios we need to make the power that we need at low RPM. So the response time of 2 turbochargers that are the same, that have the flow rate that we need, that can then respond as fast as we need them to respond, doesn't really exist. Because if you make them so small that they're responsive now, because we're feeding each one essentially 50% less exhaust, the capacity of the turbocharger drops so low that becomes not usable. As well as when we get the capacity up to be a usable number, the turbos themselves get so big that we lose all the response out of them. So that's essentially why we don't really see real twin turbos. And the other thing is we can run high boost pressure and not suffer any consequences. And we need a lot of boost pressure because we don't turn a lot of RPMs. So we need to artificially make the engine think it's bigger than it really is, and we do that through a lot of boost pressure. Now with real twin turbos, if that's all we had, we're about limited to about 50 pounds of boost. And on top of only having about 50 pounds of boost on tap reliably, to have turbos that have the flow rate as well as that can live at 50 pounds of boost, the response would be pretty bad. If we complain currently about some turbos being laggy, real twin turbos would be a nightmare. It would not be good. How you get around it, I know maybe some of you are saying there are real twin turbos out there. Yes, I've seen them. They do exist. One of the things is that they use nitrous. A lot of times the turbo is actually sized on a little bit of the smaller side with a lot of external gating, and they use nitrous to supplement the fact that it's basically when they start to run out of airflow on the turbocharger, you just gate it to hold that pressure that you know it's safe at, and you substitute that with nitrous oxide. I have not seen any real twin turbo diesel setups that are competitive and win that do not have nitrous on them. That's a real thing. They tend to run high stall converters. Most of the twin turbo stuff that are on Garrett's will be, I think they're running the GT37s for twins. So they got quite a bit of compressor capacity in those, but they're all nitrous assisted, mainly because of the response time, as well as it helps up on the top end. And there's other things that happen when you run a lot of boost pressure on turbo diesels. The fuel burn speed picks up. Because they don't get that benefit with twins because they can't run the high boost pressure. You just use nitrous to do that instead. So there's no competitive twin turbo diesels that are not running spray. So that's another kind of I'm not anti-spray, but a lot of people don't want to run it, which again knocks out the uses of the twin turbo system. And when we hear people not want to do water methanol injection because they have to fill up a tank, can you imagine if they had to go get a nitrous bottle filled? It'd be even worse to daily drive it so it took off from stoplights without smoking, but yet had enough compressor in it between the two turbochargers to make the horsepower that the system's going to make. It adds complexity. You add more heating to the oil, so the engine oil cooling system usually has to be better. There's more leak points in the system. You added 2 more leak points. And the returns on all these things are kind of minimal compared to if you ran compounds. And we got to run and this is all just for max effort stuff. We're not talking about AFR staying clean, emissions kind of stuff where we're trying to make stuff run clean, burn clean, look good in the public's eye. To do that, all these actually go a lot higher because we have to run up in the 22-to-1 plus area. So if we start looking at trying to calculate this stuff and then say, I want to do this, but I want to run it 30-to-1, or I want to run it at 28-to-1. These all go up a lot higher to do the same stuff, but smoke-free or at least at a haze compared to these kind of max effort setups. So please stay tuned for the next part. We're going to go on. The next part's going to be there are actual twin turbos on turbo diesels, but it's not what you think they are. They do exist, and they've been gaining in popularity, but they're not true twins in the sense that there's only 2 turbos on the system. If you guys already know what this is, it might give you a little bit of a smile. For those of you that don't know, please tune in next week for the next episode on this, because you might be surprised. Just don't forget to use the comment section. I like to hear from you guys, like new ideas or anything that you might be confused on, or maybe you understand some stuff but not a certain part of it and wants to go over it. Let us know. Subscribe, hit the like button, ring the bell, and stay tuned for next week, because I think next week's going to be real fun. There are twin turbos on turbo diesels, but they're not what you think they are. Thank you.